There is a specific kind of quiet that is different from all other kinds. Not the quiet of a forest at dawn, not the quiet of a room where someone you love is sleeping nearby, not the chosen quiet of a person who prefers solitude. This is a different quiet entirely. It is the quiet of a room where no one knows you are in it, where you could be somewhere else entirely and the world would continue exactly as before. It is the quiet of being present and invisible at the same time. Most people have felt it. A crowded party where you know almost no one. A city where you have just arrived and everything is new and indifferent. A relationship that has grown careful and distant. An office where people are polite but not curious. You are surrounded by other human beings, and you have never felt more alone. This feeling has a name. Scientists study it. It has measurable effects on your body, your brain, your immune system, and the length of your life. And yet for most of human history, we have treated it as a personal failure. A sign that you are difficult or weak, or simply not someone people want to be around. Today, we are going to look at what the science actually says. Welcome to Lumina Slow English. I am speaking slowly and clearly so you can follow every word. This is real psychology. This is real English. Let's begin. Let's start with a distinction that changes everything. Loneliness is not the same as being alone. This seems obvious when you say it out loud, but most people confuse these two experiences completely, and that confusion is responsible for a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Being alone is an objective condition. It means that no other people are physically present. It says nothing about how you feel. Many people seek solitude intentionally. They recharge in it. They do their clearest thinking in it. Monks, writers, long-distance runners, early risers, many people not only tolerate being alone, they require it. For them, solitude is not a problem. It is a resource. Loneliness is a subjective experience. It is not about how many people are around you. It is about the quality of your connection to other people, and whether that connection matches what you need. You can feel profoundly lonely at a dinner table surrounded by family. You can feel completely at peace alone in a room. The two things, isolation and loneliness, are related but they are not the same. John Cacioppo, one of the most important researchers in this field, spent more than 30 years studying loneliness at the University of Chicago alongside his wife and collaborator Stephanie Cacioppo. He described loneliness with a definition that is worth slowing down for. Loneliness is the perception of social isolation. Not isolation itself, the perception of it. This means that two people can be in identical social situations and experience them completely differently. One person comes home to an empty apartment and feels content. Another person comes home to the same apartment and feels as if something essential is missing. The apartment is the same. The number of people present is the same. The difference is entirely internal in how each person perceives their connection to the social world around them. And here is why Cacioppo insisted on this distinction so strongly. If loneliness were simply about being alone, the solution would be simple. Add more people. Put more people in the room. Schedule more interactions. But loneliness does not respond to quantity of contact. It responds to quality of connection. A person can fill their calendar entirely with social activity and remain profoundly lonely, because none of those interactions are giving the nervous system what it actually needs. Cacioppo argued that loneliness is not a personality flaw. It is a biological signal as ancient and as necessary as hunger or thirst or physical pain. Just as hunger signals that your body needs food, loneliness signals that your social needs are not being met. It is the body saying, you need connection. This is urgent. This is not optional. Pay attention. This reframe matters enormously. Loneliness is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something is missing, something you need, something you deserve, something the human nervous system was built to seek. Vocabulary pause. Let's stop and notice 3 words you have been absorbing in context. The first, loneliness. Loneliness is the subjective feeling of being disconnected from others, not the fact of being alone, but the internal experience of isolation. A person can be lonely in a crowd. A person can be content in complete solitude. Loneliness is always about perceived connection rather than physical proximity. It is relational, internal, and, importantly, a signal rather than a state of failure. The second, solitude. Solitude is chosen aloneness, time spent alone that is deliberate, often restorative, and not experienced as painful. Solitude is what writers seek when they need to find the right words, what introverts seek when they are overstimulated, what grieving people sometimes need before they are ready to reconnect. It is not the opposite of connection. It is often the preparation for deeper connection. Solitude and loneliness can look identical from the outside and feel completely opposite from the inside. The third, signal. In biology and psychology, a signal is information the body generates to guide behavior. Pain is a signal that something needs attention. Hunger is a signal that you need to eat. Loneliness, according to Cacioppo, functions as a social signal, a message from your nervous system that your need for connection is not being met, and that action is required. Signals are not weaknesses. They are the body's intelligence. Loneliness, solitude, signal. Now here is one of the most important paradoxes of contemporary life. We are, by almost any measurable standard, more connected than any humans who have ever lived on this planet. We carry devices that allow us to reach virtually anyone, anywhere, at any time. We have more platforms for communication than any previous generation could have imagined. We can maintain contact with hundreds of people simultaneously. We can have entire relationships conducted entirely through text, image, and voice across continents. And yet loneliness is at epidemic levels across the developed world. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued an advisory, the same kind of public health advisory issued for tobacco, opioids, and the obesity crisis, declaring loneliness a national public health emergency. He cited studies showing that roughly half of American adults reported measurable levels of loneliness. The numbers were similar or worse across much of Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. This was not a crisis of one demographic. The rates were high among teenagers, who spend more time connected online than any previous generation. High among middle-aged adults, who often have the appearance of full lives, careers, families, routines, but who report feeling deeply unseen. And highest of all among the elderly, who in many cultures now spend their final years in a degree of social isolation that would have been unrecognizable to most humans in most of history. Murthy had been thinking about loneliness long before he became Surgeon General. In his book, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World, he wrote about traveling across the United States and listening to people describe a hidden pain of disconnection, not people in obvious crisis, but doctors, teachers, executives, parents, students, people whose lives looked full and functional from the outside, and who felt, from the inside, an inexplicable emptiness, like they were going through the motions of a life they were supposed to want. The paradox can be stated simply. Digital connection is real, but it is not sufficient for the human nervous system. The kind of contact we are increasingly substituting for connection, the like, the comment, the message, the follow, satisfies the surface but not the depth. It is the nutritional equivalent of something that looks like food but does not nourish. Cacioppo distinguished between what he called the quantity of social contact and the quality of social connection. You can have enormous quantities of contact, hundreds of interactions, thousands of messages, millions of views, and still experience profound loneliness. Because what the nervous system actually needs is quality. Relationships where you feel genuinely seen, genuinely understood, genuinely safe enough to be yourself. And, crucially, in the absence of quality connection, large quantities of shallow contact can make loneliness worse. Because each surface interaction is a reminder, felt somewhere below conscious awareness, of what is missing. Vocabulary pause. 3 more words. The first, epidemic. An epidemic is a situation in which a disease or condition spreads rapidly through a population and affects far more people than historically expected. We usually reserve this word for infectious diseases. Scientists and public health officials now use it for loneliness, because the scale, the speed of increase across populations, and the consequences for human health match the definition. An epidemic of loneliness spreading quietly across the most connected societies in human history. The second, vulnerability. Vulnerability, in the psychological sense, means allowing yourself to be seen, allowing others to know your real thoughts, real feelings, real fears, without a guarantee of how they will respond. It is exposure without armor. Researcher Brené Brown spent years studying shame and connection and found, again and again, that vulnerability is the prerequisite for genuine connection. Not a nice addition, a prerequisite. You cannot be truly known by another person without letting them see something real. And for many people, that is the most frightening thing they can imagine. The third, authentic. Authentic means real, genuine, true to what something actually is. An authentic connection is one where both people are genuinely present, not performing, not carefully managing impressions, not keeping their most important parts hidden. Authenticity is what transforms contact into connection. Without it, proximity produces only the appearance of belonging, and that appearance, as we will see, can be lonelier than actual solitude, because it is the presence of the thing that was supposed to help, and the continuing absence of what you actually needed. Epidemic, vulnerability, authentic. Now I want to tell you about what loneliness does inside the body, because this is where the science becomes impossible to dismiss. Julianne Holt-Lunstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University. In 2015, she published a landmark meta-analysis, a study that combined and analyzed data from over 3 million people across dozens of independent research projects conducted around the world. She was asking a single question: does loneliness affect mortality? How long people live? The answer was stark. Loneliness, social isolation, and living alone were each associated with a significant increase in the risk of premature death. The effect size, the size of the impact, was comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. Comparable to obesity. Comparable to obesity. Holt-Lunstad described loneliness not as a social problem but as a public health crisis, and said the evidence supported treating it with the same seriousness we give to other recognized threats to physical health. Here is what researchers have found about what loneliness does to the body when it becomes chronic. The first effect is on cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. When a person is chronically lonely, cortisol levels remain persistently elevated, not spiking and returning to baseline as they would in an acute stressor, but remaining high as a steady background condition. This sustained elevation has downstream effects on almost every system in the body: cardiovascular, immune, metabolic, neurological. The second effect is inflammation. Cacioppo's lab found that chronic loneliness shifts the immune system toward a pattern characterized by elevated inflammatory markers. Short-term inflammation is useful. It helps fight infection and repair injury. Chronic, low-grade inflammation is associated with heart disease, diabetes, accelerated aging, and several forms of cancer. The third effect is on sleep. Lonely people, on average, sleep less deeply than socially connected people, even when total sleep duration is similar. The brain, operating in a state of social threat, maintains a higher level of alertness through the night. It is harder to fully rest when part of your nervous system is scanning for danger. And the fourth effect, perhaps the most striking, was Cacioppo's discovery that loneliness altered gene expression at the cellular level. Specific genes related to immune function were upregulated or downregulated in lonely individuals in ways that made their bodies simultaneously more vulnerable to certain infections and more prone to inflammatory responses. The experience of loneliness was leaving a biological signature at the level of DNA activity. The evolutionary explanation for all of this is persuasive. For the vast majority of human history, being separated from your social group was genuinely, immediately dangerous. Isolation meant exposure to cold, to predators, to injury without help, to starvation. The nervous system evolved to respond to social separation with the same urgency it would respond to physical threat. The problem is that this ancient alarm system cannot distinguish between actual physical danger and the modern experience of feeling unseen in a busy office. It treats subjective loneliness as an emergency, whether or not an emergency exists. But there is something Cacioppo discovered that explains why loneliness is so difficult to escape once it has become established. He called it the loneliness loop. Here is how it works. When a person has been chronically lonely, when disconnection has become the persistent background condition of their life, the nervous system makes an adjustment that feels protective but is actually destructive. It shifts into a state of heightened social vigilance. The brain begins monitoring every social interaction more carefully, watching for signs of rejection, dismissal, disinterest, abandonment. This makes a certain evolutionary sense. If your social environment has been unreliable, if connection has repeatedly failed or been absent, then being on alert for the next failure is a reasonable adaptation. Better to detect rejection early and protect yourself than to be caught off guard. But this vigilance has a hidden cost. Because the brain, now highly sensitized to negative social signals, begins to see them everywhere. A colleague who seems distracted becomes a colleague who finds you uninteresting. A friend who cancels plans becomes a friend who is gradually pulling away. A pause before someone responds becomes a sign that they are choosing their words carefully because they do not want to tell you the truth. The world, seen through the lens of chronic loneliness, becomes a place where rejection is always just about to happen. And this internal shift produces external behavior. The person who expects rejection begins to protect themselves. They become slightly more guarded, slightly less likely to initiate contact, less willing to be vulnerable, to take the small risks that genuine connection requires. They hold themselves back in social situations without quite knowing why. Other people, sensing this guardedness, though they rarely understand its source, respond with slightly more distance. Not out of cruelty, but because closeness requires openness on both sides, and one side has closed down, and the loop closes. The loneliness produces behavior that produces responses that produce more loneliness. A person can remain trapped in this loop for years, not because they do not want connection, but because the very mechanism meant to protect them from the pain of rejection is preventing the connection that would heal it. This is why simply telling a lonely person to just put yourself out there is not only unhelpful but slightly cruel. The issue is not a lack of desire or opportunity. The issue is a nervous system that has been trained by accumulated experience to expect that connection will fail. And that is now making that expectation self-fulfilling. Vocabulary pause. 3 final words. The first, hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a state of elevated alertness, typically triggered by past experiences of threat or pain, in which the brain continuously scans the environment for signs of danger. In the context of loneliness, hypervigilance is specifically social. The lonely person's nervous system watches every interaction for signals of potential rejection. This watchfulness feels, from the inside, like reasonable caution. From the outside, it functions like a barrier. And in the cruelest irony, it most intensely blocks the exact connections that could relieve it. The second, chronic means persisting over an extended period of time, rather than occurring briefly and then resolving. Chronic pain is different from acute pain. It does not come and go, it stays. It shapes how you move and think and plan. Chronic loneliness is the same. Not occasional feelings of disconnection, but a sustained state that becomes the background condition of daily life. The word matters because chronic conditions need different responses than acute ones. Chronic conditions cannot be resolved by willpower or pushing through. The third, resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover from adversity, to be disrupted, shaken, destabilized, and still return to functioning, connection, and hope. Researchers who study loneliness are increasingly interested in what makes certain people resilient to it, what allows some people, after genuine periods of isolation and disconnection, to find their way back to belonging. Almost universally, what they find is not programs, not systems, not platforms. It is relationships, specific, real, high-quality relationships, even just one or two, that provided a foundation stable enough to recover from. Hypervigilance, chronic, resilience. So, how does a person actually break out of the loneliness loop? Cacioppo spent the second half of his career asking exactly this question, and his answer was careful, because he understood the mechanism well enough to know that simple prescriptions would fail. He found that the first step was perceptual, not behavioral. Before a lonely person can act differently, they need to see differently. Specifically, to recognize that the hypervigilance they are experiencing, the constant low-level expectation of rejection, is a symptom of chronic loneliness, not an accurate reading of social reality. The threat the brain is detecting is mostly constructed from past pain and present prediction, not present evidence. This is not easy. The feelings are real. The sensitivity is real. The fear of rejection is real. But recognizing that the brain is currently operating in threat detection mode, and that this mode systematically distorts how you read other people, creates a small gap. And in that gap, choice becomes possible. The second step Cacioppo identified was what he called extending. Not a grand gesture of connection, not throwing yourself at strangers, not joining 12 clubs, not performing extroversion until it breaks you, but making one small, genuine, low-risk extension toward another person. A brief, real conversation instead of a surface one. A moment of actual curiosity about someone else's experience. A small act of helpfulness or kindness, not transactionally, not in exchange for anything, but as a practice of engagement with the world. The reason small matters is the same reason it mattered in the research on learned helplessness. The brain needs evidence. One genuine moment of real connection, however brief, however modest, begins to update the prediction the nervous system has been running. It inserts a data point that says, connection is possible here. People can be safe. Being seen does not necessarily mean being rejected. That data point does not dissolve chronic loneliness overnight, but it begins to shift the internal environment from which connection either grows or cannot. Vivek Murthy ended his Surgeon General's advisory with something that surprised some readers. He did not recommend an app. He did not recommend a clinical program. He recommended something older and less convenient. Time spent with each other in physical space. Organizations reconsidering how they structure work and community. The rebuilding of third places, spaces neither home nor work, where human beings historically encountered each other without agenda. The village square, the neighborhood cafe, the public park, the community gathering. But he also said something more personal. He wrote that what changed his own experience of loneliness was not a policy. It was a small number of relationships in which he chose to be genuinely known. Not curated. Not managed. Not the version of himself that was performing competence and confidence. Known. This is where the science of loneliness converges every time. Not a solution from outside. Not the right algorithm or the optimized social calendar, but the willingness, at some point, to let someone see you as you actually are. To risk the vulnerability that real connection requires. To extend toward another person despite the fear, despite the loneliness loop, despite the hypervigilance, despite the accumulated experience of disconnection, and to choose, one small moment at a time, to be present instead of protected. Because the human nervous system was not designed for isolation. It was shaped, across hundreds of thousands of years, for exactly this. The experience of being genuinely known by another person and still being wanted. Still being chosen. Still belonging. That is not a luxury. That is a biological need. As real as hunger. As ancient as the species. And it is available, not easily, not without risk, not always in the form we expected or hoped for, but available. Before you go, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer it in English in the comments below. Think of a time when you felt genuinely connected to another person, really seen, really known, even briefly. And answer this. What made that connection feel real? Not who the person was, not the place or the circumstance, just what was present in that moment that is so often absent. What quality of attention or honesty or safety made that moment different? One sentence, in English. That is all. I will read them. This was Lumina Slow English. Thank you for listening so carefully today, and I will see you in the next one.